What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with a takeaways video for the Detroit Lions. Today, I'm going to be discussing my takeaways from Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell's pressers at the Combine. So let's get it started.
Continue the same approach that we've always had, and just we want to add good football players that fit our culture and guys that we love.
Welcome, everybody, to another video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, we are back with another Lions video, of course, and today we're going through some press conference takeaways. Now, this took place at the Combine, but just because it was at the Combine does not mean that these questions were necessarily about the Combine. They were about free agency, the draft, off-season hirings, movement, things like that. Pretty much everything, because we haven't heard from these two guys really since the season has ended, which has been a little bit at this point in time. I mean, the Super Bowl's over. It's been a few months. So with that, they speak to the media. They answer a lot of different questions about a lot of different things. And in this video, we did the same thing last year. And I think they only do one. Actually, I kind of get the vibe that they do more than one press conference there. I'm not completely sure. If they do, great. We can do another video on it. If not, that's fine, because they gave us some good information here. And you know, they're never going to give you exact answers on things. You can't be like, hey, who are you taking at 6? You know, they're not going to give you that kind of direction. But I thought there were some interesting nuggets that were thrown in there. So like we did last year, I just wanted to dive into some of my key takeaways from each of their press conferences. Sure, I do have a pretty good amount of notes here, but it was also pretty long. I mean, in fairness, you know, they asked him a pretty good amount of questions. It was like 20 minutes each. Heard from Brad Holmes first, and the first thing, well, one of the first things he talked about was Levi's health, and I think this is a great update because we really don't get a lot of updates with Levi. I mean, I hear rumors, some good, some bad, about Levi's progress, what could happen with Levi, and I really don't know what to trust out there. I don't know what's going on with Levi, so this was a great update to get. We really don't get videos of him working out and things like that like Jeff Okudah posted. At least I haven't seen those. So with that, this is what Brad Holmes said about Levi. He said Levi is continuing his rehab. He said he saw him at the facility before he left. Basically, he kind of is on schedule in the sense of his rehab, but his overall kind of just message to it was basically, we'll see where it goes, but we're going to be smart with it. To me, it was kind of promising because I've heard bad rumors like, oh, this is it for Levi, it's over, like he's not doing his work. That's not what Brad Holmes said. I don't know if he would have said that anyway, but I wouldn't say this is necessarily pessimistic news. I don't know what to really make of this. I don't know what kind of schedule they have here for him. If anything, it wasn't like a straightforward answer of like, yeah, Levi's going to be fine. He's going to be ready for the offseason. It was kind of just like, we'll see where it goes. And at the same time, we're going to be smart with it. So I think to that, you know, because we've kind of wrestled around with this a lot this offseason, I always like to add a 3-tech defensive tackle this offseason. When I do that in like my mock offseason, we talk free agency, we talk draft. So with that, I do believe that the Lions will likely add in some way, shape, or form a defensive tackle that they view can possibly start at that position, regardless of who that is. And then with Levi, I'm hoping the best because I really still do like this player, and I'm not sure what the health is going to look like. We know that he had back surgery, which is definitely a difficult thing to recover from, especially in a physical sport like this, where it's about leverage, and definitely would help if it was a little bit more attacking for him in his first season. But with that being said, man, even going back and just watching his film at Washington, like, I'm so intrigued by the player. Even more now, I'm fascinated because you see his body type tied along with his explosiveness, his versatility, and you're like, oh, this could definitely be something. It still wasn't all there then, but it could be something. And you remember that he didn't play in his final season at Washington because of the COVID year, so he opted out. So we already had that. Then the year that he came in, he's dealing with injuries. He's playing a defense that doesn't fit him. Then this past year, we're excited. We're like, okay, this will be the year for him. And then no. He's out again because of an injury. He missed the entire season. So at this point in time with the whole Levi situation, I don't know what to make of it. I'm hoping for the best, but I do believe the Lions will address this position. I think it's one of their biggest needs, and I think they will address it as that. But the door could still be open for Levi working his way back into it. I'm not sure from this answer that I would say it looks like, okay, Lions aren't going to want to necessarily try to find a long-term answer there because they still believe Levi could end up taking over that role. It didn't sound that confident, kind of just like, well, we'll see where it goes, but I'm sure the door will be open for him to compete. I'm just hoping for the best there. Brad essentially confirmed that yes, the Lions want to add help to the defense side of the ball, which is probably not news to you. Okay, I think we all understand that. He also did say that every position is on the table. Like, they went through every position, and at this point, every position is on the table to add help, whether that's starters or whether that's potentially reserves, but every position is on the table. Now, I think he said something pretty similar last year, but I do think there is a point there where if you really go through each position, you could make a case where, okay, we could use more. Whether that's starters or just depth, you could say that there could be something added. If anything, maybe the positions that wouldn't necessarily fall into that category is probably a long snapper, assuming that, you know, you pick up the tender on Scott Daly, punter Jack Fox, and maybe safety, but safety I still think is going to need some depth just because of who's under contract. So really, there's not a lot of positions where you can say, well, we don't need to add anything to that. And again, some are going to be heavier than others. Others need starters. For example, cornerback looks like it's going to need a starter. Safety doesn't look like it's going to need a starter, but every position is on the table is what he said. And I think he made a really good point that I'm going to tie together. I don't know if he followed up with this, but I'm going to tie it together where he said this past season, they drafted 6 defensive players. So he's basically like, the cupboard is not bare of defensive players. We do believe that there's foundation, there's a core pieces that we can build around there. And he said 5 of those 6 rookies played a big role for us last season. When he first said that, I was like, no way. The Lions, did they really draft 6 defensive players? But then I was like, oh yeah, they did. I remember, I think it was like 6-2. So I went back through and just going through the names, I'm going to read them off. Aiden Hutchinson, he was a starter for the Lions. He was one of the best rookies in football this season. Josh Paschal, who I wouldn't say played a massive role with the Lions because it kind of took a while for him to see the action on the field because of health things coming into the year. But with that, as the year kind of went on, he did start to find a little bit of a role, and I think you just saw what his role was going to be within the Lions defense going forward, at least what the vision is. With that being said, though, I don't want to count out and act like he's not versatile, like he does have potential to move around the defensive line, because we have seen him play stand-up edge, even though I didn't think that he looked the most comfortable there. I think the 5-tech range is kind of where he looks the best. With that being said, though, I'm a believer in Josh Paschal. I know there's some questions that's been thrown out there. I don't have any questions for Josh Paschal. I think he looked like what I anticipated coming out of the draft, as a guy that, yeah, when he's working against tackles, he's going to be limited as a pass rusher. Like, everything that I kind of thought about the player, I thought he kind of just looked like that last year. Now it's just about how many snaps does he get and what role does he get to play in. But continuing, Kirby Joseph, right? He kind of burst onto the scene for the Detroit Lions, and by the time he became a starter, he absolutely took off. He lit up Aaron Rodgers. Kirby Joseph was outstanding this past season. He's going to be a starter going forward. Malcolm Rodriguez, I believe, is going to be a starter going forward. He was someone that, it was weird because when we drafted him, I remember a lot of our talks were like, man, this guy's going to start. And then it was kind of like downplayed initially when the Lions drafted him by Brad Holmes. In fairness, completely understand, especially where you picked him in the draft. But as we watched through Hard Knocks, he kind of just was like, that guy's going to play. Like, someone's got to take it from him. That guy's going to play. And he did. He ended up playing, and he was basically the guy for the entire season for the Lions. I mean, you rotated pieces. He missed some time a little bit, but for the most part, he was the guy as a will linebacker for the Lions. James Houston. Okay, again, another guy that it came in, it was like, where is he going to fit? He didn't even make the 53-man roster, but because of injuries and things like that, he ultimately got his opportunity. He was showing well in practice, some of that pass rush upside, and they were kind of like, do we play him off-ball linebacker? Do we play him at edge? And like, let's just simplify the role, okay? Because at Jackson State, he played edge rusher. He was more athletic than anybody out there. Let's just do that. His stats were insane. He played a little bit of off-ball at Florida, but let's just put him at edge rusher. And that's what the Lions did because of injuries. And it was like immediately, oh, okay, he's productive. He got a couple of sacks, and it was like, all right, he's going to get some more playing time. And then from there on, he, at one point, had more sacks than Aiden Hutchinson. I know that's not everything. I don't put everything into that, but I do think, yes, great point there. He was a big part of our defense, and now it looks like he's a core piece going forward. And then finally, it was really Chase Lucas that didn't really play for the Lions. He did a tad, but he didn't really play for the Lions this past season. However, with that being said, I do still believe that Chase Lucas could start at slot for the Lions this upcoming season. It would not shock me if he did. So with that, I think he made a great point. I don't look at the defense and think the cupboard is bare. I'm exactly right there with Brad Holmes. It's kind of how I look at this defense. Like, I don't think it is, especially considering I think we're going to re-sign certain players. Now, we'll see, because that's going to affect a lot, right? Alex Anzalone, does he get re-signed? John Kaminsky, does he get re-signed? You know, which cornerbacks get re-signed? So there's questions of that, but with some of just re-signings that you kind of anticipate, the defense isn't completely without talent. They're not devoid of talent, right? Even after the season, Brad Holmes felt like the linebacker position kind of became a strength of the team. The cornerback position still has Jeff, still has Jerry. They got some other guys for depth. They have to re-sign or go get new pieces. Safety looks pretty good to me. And then defense line has core pieces across the board. They just need a legit defensive tackle right now, I think, to pair with Aleem. But Aleem, Hutch, James Houston, Josh Paschal, like, that's a legit core foundation to build around there. So I'm with him. I don't think the cupboard is bare. I understand, like he said, and I think he made a great point. Yeah, if you look at it on total stats and total yards on the season, say they're ranked 32nd, it'd be easy to say that they need everything on defense. But I don't agree with that. And I also don't agree that every pick is going to be defense. Okay, I think it'll probably lean that way. but I don't think every pick is going to be defense, nor do I think every pick needs to be defense. Because yes, the defense did take massive strides in the second half of the season. They were much better. They weren't all the way there yet, and they still have room to grow. There's certain positions, cornerback, DT for me, I think are the most pressing needs, but it's not there. Like, it's not going to be, and there's going to be some re-signings that I'm anticipating. We'll see on those because that kind of affects the stance as well, but I thought he made a great point there. He touched on the fact that they lost their college scouting director. Now, this, I believe, happened towards the end of January, where college scouting director Dave Sears, who was our college scouting director since 2019, Dave Sears left to join the Arizona Cardinals as an assistant general manager. And like Brad put, it was a great opportunity. So for him, I mean, that's like the next step behind becoming the general manager. So congratulations to him, wishing him the best of luck. But as Brad said, we do have Brian Hudspeth, who is our assistant college scouting director, and he's pretty much going to take over that role through the draft. Personally, I don't think this is much of a big deal. I know we never really did a video on it, but to just tap on it really quickly, I don't think this is a massive deal for this year's draft. I mean, sure, you'd like to have him, I think, a part of the room. He's such a big name in that room. It'd be very beneficial to have that, I think, through the draft process, but it's not something that's going to be, I think, oh, it's a killer that we lost him, because there's a reason he was able to take that job. Even when he did, yeah, he got the opportunity, but also on top of that, at this time, I mean, the end of January, you know, scouting reports are in. At this time, you're cross-checking things, you're meeting with players in person, maybe more than you already have, but it's not like these guys are going out there and scouting players and things like that. Like the film watch, all that stuff is basically done. So I don't think this is a massive, like, oh, this is a killer for the Lions. And by the way, this is Brian Hudspeth. I know this looks kind of random, but I did want to throw this in here that, you know, around the draft time is where you do have, you know, sometimes those scouting contracts are up, and that's when people move. I know sometimes the breaks happen during this time because, again, you've done a lot of that work. I mean, going forward, we're going to have to figure out how that goes, but I also got a lot of faith in Brian Hudspeth from afar. I mean, this is someone that 26 plus years of experience. He started off, you have to go back to 2003 with the Atlanta Falcons. All right. This was a guy that was a scouting assistant. That's where he began. He's worked through all the way through that. He was a national scout with the Lions, worked with multiple different teams. You know, he's been a regional scout. He's been an area scout. He's been a pro scout, right? So this is a guy that's done a lot of different roles in the scouting department. So I have a lot of confidence this guy's going to be able to hold it down, and he'll probably be that guy for the Lions going forward if I had to guess. Speaking a little bit, I guess, to the defensive side, but I think this is really everything as a whole here. Brad Holmes did say that they came in with a strategy to continue to be young and develop those guys. They had to learn how to win. So he attributed that as to some of the factor as maybe why it took a little bit, but they got rolling and they won 8 of their last 10 games. I think there's just a little graphic that I want to throw up here, and this is not new. I have put this up before, but just to kind of put into context or perspective of what Brad Holmes is saying here. If you look at this graph, you can see the Lions' average age. Now, this is just the defense side of the ball. I think offense is a little bit different because you got some vet O-linemen, sort of. I mean, Frank's not really a vet, but Decker's a vet. I mean, Frank is a vet, but he's not super old. You know, receiver position, right? DJ Chark, I mean, he's still very young at the receiver position, but Josh Reynolds has some experience. Chark has some experience. But defensively, first thing you notice is from 2020 to 2022, this past year, the turnover. There's only really 2 carryovers, Jeff Okudah and Will Harris. Will Harris playing a much bigger role in a complete different position now. So there's not a lot of carryover. On top of that, the Lions have basically improved in terms of added value across the board for the most part when I went through this as a video. Jay's there on the bottom, and those are just the guys that I basically contexted as starters of 24 and a half years old. That's extremely young. 24 and a half years old. I mean, in most situations, a 24 and a half year old would still be on his rookie deal. Right, so that's where the Lions' age was at defensively, just to put that into context. So just to give you guys some perspective on what Brad is really saying there. Yeah, this is a young defense specifically. Guys like Michael Brockers, yes, would count, and he'd probably move the age up. He wasn't really a starter for the Lions last season. He started beginning of the year, but he didn't take a majority of the snaps because basically after the New England Patriots game, or yeah, before the New England Patriots game, but from then on, he didn't really play for the Lions. Just to reiterate a point I made in a previous video, but I think this speaks to the talent defensively. The biggest names and the biggest signings that the Lions have really given out to the defensive side of the ball have not really played, whether that be Romeo Okwara or Tracy Walker and those 2 big re-signings. They haven't really played. Charles missed a ton of time this past season. So where the Lions have either invested through the draft, which has mainly become a lot of their playing time, or the big name free agent re-signings basically that they've given out, haven't really played to this point due to injury. So I don't think the Lions are just, they don't have talent. They have talent. You can see it when you look through the roster. Speaking on Jamaal Williams, you've probably seen this headline somewhere, and this has been something that's been popping up. Jamaal Williams and the Lions' decision there. This is what Brad Holmes said. He is an unrestricted free agent. He said, we've had conversations with all of our unrestricted free agents. And he said this, they're currently having discussions with Jamaal Williams. He said, we talked to all our UFAs, and Jamaal Williams is one of those guys that there is mutual interest, he believes, on both sides to bring him back. And he also noted that they still have DeAndre Swift under contract. So I don't know if there's something like little under the surface you can take from that, meaning how heavily are the Lions looking to invest in running back? Again, all positions are, I think, on the table, but I always try to look for like those little things in there that's kind of just subtle thrown in there. The fact that he brought up that Swift is still under contract, to me, if anything, the safe approach I take from that is that I do believe DeAndre Swift is going to be a Lion this next season. And Dan talked about it a little bit. I do believe he will be a Lion this next season. I mean, if they got a great deal, I think that maybe something happens, but I think he's going to be a Lion, and I think Jamaal Williams is going to be a Lion. But I think that kind of speaks to he likes that duo, that tandem of those two, and you have the guys like Craig and potentially a new addition to that, Justin Jackson. Jamar Jefferson still technically under contract, even though he didn't bring him up, but he did bring up that Swift was still under contract. Maybe adding players, the quarterback position. He said, we love Jared Goff, and we've had conversations with him, but we don't have anyone behind him, because he was asked about adding a backup quarterback, and he's like, but we understand, and we've had these conversations with him. We don't have anything behind him. And one thing that he says he needs to do a better job of versus last year, because last year, they're kind of just stumbling into the backup quarterback position, and then ultimately they were able to acquire Nate Sudfeld right before, the season started from the San Francisco 49ers, yet he didn't even play in the preseason for us because of when we acquired him. They rolled with Tim Boyle and David Blau. They didn't add anything to that group, and because of that, I mean, they had like tryouts, but they didn't add anything to that group, and then it didn't really look good in the preseason, and the Lions kind of had to scramble and find Nate Sudfeld. It didn't sound necessarily like the Lions were looking to bring back Nate Sudfeld, who's 30 years old at this point. He said Sudfeld did well, for what he did during the season. They'll have their own like practice film and things like that, so that's something to keep an eye on. But it does sound like the Lions are definitely going to put more of an emphasis on addressing backup quarterback, because we don't have anyone behind Jared Goff, and I don't think the Lions would have felt confident with Boyle or Blau as the backup, and that's why they did what they did, and we're like, we're cutting them both. We got to go find someone. And for them, luckily, Sudfeld became available, and I do think it was an upgrade, but the Lions may be looking for more of an upgrade over that.
We've had these open, transparent conversations about, we're happy with Jared. He's our starter, but, we need to add some pieces in that room overall. So whether it's in, free agency or, in the draft.
And I do think there was an interesting point made by Brad Holmes that was kind of thrown in there also about the free agency side, because again, everything's on the table for the draft, and it could very well be a draft pick that they use to add potentially that backup quarterback, as Brad Holmes put it. But also, when he brought up free agency side, he did bring up that with the quarterback position, a lot of these guys won't want to necessarily make a decision until the draft has already happened, which immediately takes my mind to kind of like the bridge potential quarterbacks of the Marcus Mariotas, if he's looking to potentially go to a team and maybe that doesn't have a quarterback to be the bridge or whatever it may be. The guys of maybe the Jacoby Brissett's, who's 30 years old, whether that be maybe the Drew Locks, who's 26 years old. Like, do certain guys want to have an opportunity to compete? Guys like that, the Sam Darnolds, who could be available, just going through some names, or the older guys like the Case Keenums, they're maybe just trying to find the right spot. So I think that was a nice little interesting point that he threw in there. However, I did catch Brad at the end there when he threw in for development. That could come through free agency with a young guy or a guy that you feel like hasn't maybe gotten the great chance to this point. But I do think that they would like to potentially add that through the draft to have that development, because it just makes sense with Goff's contract situation. Not to say that it has to be a high pick, but just for development and to get another name in there. And then again, on top of that, you could add a free agent to have a third quarterback going into the season. It was mentioned that he felt like there's a really good core of young guys at the tight end position, which I thought was interesting, because essentially the Lions only have one tight end that's really under contract here. Also, quick little note, Derek Deese Jr. is technically also under contract. He was a UDFA pickup a year ago for this upcoming season. Cheap contract, no guarantees there, but just thought I would point it out. Mitchell's under contract under his rookie deal, but Shane Zylstra's a free agent. Brock Wright's a free agent. Now, they're both exclusive rights free agent, which kind of gives me the sense that both those guys are going to be picked up their tender and they're going to be brought back for this season, at least have an opportunity to compete in the offseason. Again, like you said, we're open to upgrading any position, but he also kind of took a shot at a little bit of the media here, which I think was was well earned, and I appreciate the shot. TJ Hawkinson move is actually looked at as a trade now, I think, amongst kind of the Lions media, instead of maybe just waving the white flag. Because yes, and I think I said this, I'm not completely sure, but I'm pretty sure I did. I know I was upset at the time because Lions were 1-6, and when you see him trade away TJ Hawkinson, who was a big part of their offense at the time, it was like, what the heck? And we weren't healthy. DJ Chark wasn't healthy. Like, we had a lot going on offensively, and as a team, we were losing games. Close games, yes, but we were losing games, and you make that trade, and it did kind of feel like, you know, the vibe was like, whoa, what are the Lions? I mean, seriously? Like, they're allowed to just, you know, trade that away and get assets and tank on the season? Like, how is that okay? But he brought it up, and he was kind of like, yeah, no, that's not what that move was. All right, that was a good offer that we got, and yes, we were 1-6 at the time, but I'm glad it's looked at as a trade now, and that our plan was going to pay off, because ultimately it did, and they turned it around, and it was like, okay, here go the Lions, and now that trade looks genius. Even though I didn't have a problem with the trade at the time, I thought the deal was fine. We've talked about this, but it definitely, because of the time that happened, had some people upset. Conversations are currently going on with players on this team about restructures and their agents. Not necessarily to do it right now, it sounds like, but if down the road financially that was something that they had to do, that they would have already had those conversations. Because I know we always talk about restructures as like, hey, you know, just restructure that guy's base salary, give him a signing bonus. Well, the player still has to agree to that. And they're probably going to, but they still have to. Or if you're restructuring in a different way, however that may be, you know, whatever that may be. So those things are still things that the player has to agree to. So he's kind of already said, like, we've had those conversations in case we want to do one of those things. I'm still betting on Frank Ragnow. Makes the most sense for the Lions there. Also talking on trades, he said you always have to be prepared for trade scenarios, but this is still kind of early in that process. But he said we were getting prepared for that, looking at who was around us as soon as we knew what the draft order was. We ended the year with momentum, and we're headed in the right direction, and he's confident in the process that they're taking. And this ties into the free agents. He felt like maybe the first year where he was here, you know, they weren't necessarily sure if the guys that they were reaching out, even though they didn't give out any kind of big time deals. And I'm going to stop myself right here because I am going to touch on this a little bit with Dan Campbell as well. But Brad Holmes did make it clear that you do have to be careful with free agency, and it sounds like he may follow a similar path to what he has followed. And I think that's just the long-term plan there. He's basically said, you don't need to go spend the most money. It's not about how much money you spend in free agency. It's about getting the right players. And Dan Campbell said a very similar thing, but I thought he made it kind of clear there. It's not about, hey, we have more money to spend, so we need to go spend it all, or we have to go make that big splash signing that everybody talks about. We have to go get the right players. And the free agents that we have brought in have been beneficial to the team. And again, I think a lot of that just pulls itself back to that's the vision of how he wants to build this thing. It's what he was a part of with LA, was build through the draft, give out, prove it type of deals, and extend the guys that you had. Like, that's what he understood. That's what he was around. And, you know, maybe they made their occasional trade if something became available that, hey, that guy's not supposed to be available. But for the most part, that's how he built the team. That's how they built the team. And it seems like he's going to follow a very similar process this offseason. And just like he said before, if you earn it, you know, those guys will get re-signed. They want to get there and bring their guys back. But the guys that they were reaching out to would want to come here because they were just beginning. But now he feels like, hey, you know, almost like we're in charge. Like no, we're setting the demands. It's like one of these things where you have to meet our standards. It's not like maybe they're not going to want to come here. Like, they're going to want to come here because we're going to get the best out of you here. But now you got to make sure that you meet our standards. Like, that's kind of the vibe that I got there from Brad Holmes. But those were my main takeaways from Brad Holmes. On to Dan Campbell. Dan Campbell started off talking about the coaching staff changes, saying that we'll miss Todd Wash, we'll miss Deuce Staley, and we'll miss John Morton, which, yeah, I'm upset about the John Morton one. I told y'all John Morton, who was the Lions offensive assistant this past season, was going to be kind of that hot name after this year. That was my prediction. Last year was Ben Johnson. I thought this year would be John Morton as an offensive assistant because of his background, what he had done in the past working with quarterbacks, how he has helped the passing game so much. And we don't get to see those things, right? We're not aware of those, but Dan touched on it, which I appreciated. But he was talking about like how they missed John Morton, and I think it is a tough loss for the Lions. He actually went with Sean Payton to the Denver Broncos, and he said for all three of those guys, it was really about family, you know, getting closer to home for all three of those guys. We kind of assumed that with Deuce Staley. He brought that up with Todd Wash and also with John Morton as well. Then touching on some of the hirings that they made, he said for Scotty Montgomery, who is now our running backs coach, he said, and their assistant head coach, by the way, he said he interviewed him last year before they ended up naming Ben Johnson the OC for the offense coordinator position, which is when we talked about him. We've done a video on all these these guys, by the way. So if you want their own specific video, go check out that video for sure. But he did say that he was very impressed by Scotty Montgomery, that he brings versatility, you know, because he's coached receivers, he's coached running backs, dude's been an offensive coordinator, dude's been a head coach. All right, he brings a lot of versatility, and he feels like it's a big acquisition for the Lions. So that was something that, you know, he tried to look at it as an opportunity, that while these guys were leaving and we're going to miss them, it's also an opportunity to potentially look to even get better, right? And Scotty Montgomery is a guy that obviously around the league is pretty well known, and he's pretty well respected, and he's in a big-time role for the Lions, and that, I think, is a huge hiring. Steve Hyden, another guy we've done a video on, who was our tight ends coach, he said Tanner Inkstrand is now specifically like he is just our pass game coordinator, which I think makes sense, right? Again, you lose a guy like John Morton, so he can really just focus on being the pass game coordinator. He said, though, that they could still add to that position, but what he liked about Steve Hyden is his background working with offensive linemen, and he feels like he's going to bring some toughness to that positional group that's necessary. And we know we love our tight ends to block. I think there's room for improvement with our tight end blocking. I really do. I think James Mitchell's got high upside there, but he's young, and that's something that's always been brought up, is how young this group of tight ends are that we currently have, assuming Shane, Brock, and James Mitchell. Like, it's young, but James Mitchell has high upside. I think Brock can be a better blocker, and even though Shane's, you know, not necessarily known for that, he's more of the receiving tight end, still something that, you know, could be valuable. And then obviously if it's a new guy, it's probably going to be a young guy, maybe draft, maybe UDFA, maybe free agent. Regardless, it's probably going to be a young guy. We'll see. Maybe they'll want to add a veteran to that mix, but he likes that he kind of brings some toughness, he believes, to that tight end position. You know, Dan Campbell. Hey, Dan Campbell was no Travis Kelce. You know, hey, look, I'm just saying, he wasn't the big-time receiving guy. Dan Campbell would do the dirty work, okay? That was the guy that came in and blocked, right? That he even said he came in and he blocked. So you know Dan Campbell's about that toughness, all right? So he's like, hey, that dude's worked with offensive linemen. Give me him. Give me that guy. Dre Bly, who is now working specifically with the Lions. He is not our defensive backs coach. He is the cornerbacks coach. And he said that Brian Duker is going to take on that room. So Brian Duker is now the defensive backs coach. Last year we fired Aubrey Pleasant, so it's Brian Duker's room, who was our safeties coach. And Dre Bly they brought in to specifically work with cornerbacks. He's been at North Carolina for a little while now. We did a video on him as well. He's a former Lions cornerback. He's a former outstanding cornerback, whether with the Lions, elsewhere, college. The production that he put up is insane, all right? He's a little bit undersized, which we understand in our cornerback room, but my goodness, was he productive. And because he was undersized, as Dan Campbell put it, he had to be a technician. So what he's going to do for us is he's going to bring that technique. You know, he's going to bring the guy that's focused on the fundamentals and just work with our cornerbacks, and he thinks that's something that this cornerback room needs. And on top of that, lines are very young in the cornerback room, right? Jeff Okuda's still young, rookie deal. Jerry Jacobs still young. You know, new addition, probably going to be still young through the draft. You know, Will Harris, if he's back, transitioning. Mike Hughes, yeah, I wouldn't say he's still young, but the point is that's what they were aiming for with Dre Bly, which is exactly what I got from Dre Bly and kind of that addition there, because that's, I think, what you're getting. You're getting a cornerback guru, as guys have put it in the past that have worked with Dre Bly as he has been their coach. Also, we said they reached the agreement with John Fox. We touched on that in our last video. And to that, he brought up John Morton and what John Morton brought to the offense that was behind the scenes. And while some people maybe didn't realize what he brought, by the way, I think if y'all watched this channel, y'all knew what he brought. I was a John Morton guy. Shout out to John Morton. But he said with John Fox, he believes is kind of going to bring what John Morton brought to the offense, which was kind of like the blind side for the offensive coordinator and Ben Johnson, which also, I think on top of that, you got to keep in mind, this guy had experience. I believe he was a former OC. Ben Johnson never technically actually been an offensive coordinator. It'd be beneficial to have someone kind of in your corner that can help you out, protect that blind spot. He said kind of similarly, John Fox is going to be what Dom Capers was, which we touched on. Dom Capers, well, in our first season, was that defensive assistant for the Lions, and that's not what John Fox is. He said John Fox, and I didn't even realize this, the connection that he has with John Fox goes back to when he was a New York Giant as a player. When he played tight end, he was the defensive coordinator. John Fox is a defensive-minded coach. Feel free to go check out our last video. We kind of dive into all of those things. He was out for a few years. He was actually working as an analyst before this past year, getting back at it with the Indianapolis Colts. I just got that sense that he still has that fire in him. He likes the chess match. He has that fire in him to get back into it, but he's just working for the defense. Kind of going to have that blind spot protect the blind spot of Aaron Glenn, but also his specialties defensive backs. And the Lions got a new guy there in Dre Bly. Look, we touched on it in the video, but my point is I like the hiring. Guy's got tons of experience. Guy's got a lot of good experience. He's a winner. He's loyal. He's the player's coach, John Fox. All right, continuing on. He also touched on John Scott Jr., who was our defensive lines coach, who he said they met the agreement with, they came to an agreement with, even though neither of those two are officially signings, but they did come to agreement with. And like Dre Bly, he said for John Scott Jr., he's a technician coach. That's what they're bringing in here. Obviously, they lost Todd Wash, but he said what they were looking for, because this is a guy that's all about technique, he didn't necessarily need a guy that had a whole bunch of NFL experience. He was okay with getting a guy like John Scott Jr., who really hasn't worked in the NFL. He's been an assistant defensive line coach for 1 year with the New York Jets. Outside of that, he's basically just exclusively worked at the college level as a defensive line coach for multiple different schools, special teams coach as well, and also on top of that, he's a former defensive end for Western Carolina. So what John Scott Jr. he feels brings is that technical side, the ability to develop players. We talked and touched on in our last video on all the players that he's been a part of helping get to the NFL. He's worked with DT specifically, he's worked with edge rushers specifically, and he's worked as a defensive line coach. But he's helped develop a lot of top players, whether that's going to the NFL, whether that's being All-Americans, and he feels like he's just kind of a technician that has that ability to develop talent. And again, we just talked about how young this defensive line is. Hutchinson, who I thought was pulling out things last year that I didn't even see in college. I was like, what? I didn't see him do that in college. But he's still young, year two. Ali McNeil, right? He brought that up as well. Levi, hopefully, if he can be healthy. James Houston. So with his versatility in terms of him working with outside linebackers and DT specifically, you're probably going to have a new addition to that somewhere, maybe multiple through the draft, also maybe free agency as well. But I think he made a really good point there about him and Dre Bly. Basically, the technician side is kind of what they're looking to add there in terms of the player development. And I think that's huge because a lot of times I don't think that gets talked about. You know, when you scout the players and you get them, but also the player development, because we don't really see it. I mean, you kind of can say you see it, but it's also difficult. But behind the scenes, that player development for a positional coach, I think can go a lot of times under the radar. And we're talking about a roster that's this young, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, and these defensive coaches that you've acquired. And if you're going to add new guys, if you're going to build through the draft, you're going to build this young way, and we're going to roll young, and we need to develop these guys. You got to have technicians that can develop them. So while technically, let's say we go draft a cornerback in the first round, just for example. Let's do this. Defensive end. Let's say Lions draft defense tackle first round. Technically, he's no longer a college player. He's now an NFL player. But he's just 1 year removed from college. He literally hasn't played in the NFL. So for a guy that's worked at the college level, that knows what it looks like to be an NFL player because of experience, but he's worked with a lot of college kids and helped them develop, it potentially could help you with that process because they are basically still just a college player, right? So whether that's putting on the right weight, whatever that may be, but also the technical side, because I think a lot of times that's what you get is the FBI, which they always aim for, but also the technical side that a lot of times is going to need work, and maybe it's got to be different because they coach it differently and they want different things out of the players. He did say that John Scott Jr. was kind of in, I think he said John Scott Jr. specifically, was kind of in that same tree, of what we like to do defensively, like we touched on in our last video. Go check that video out if you have not. Continuing with the NFL Combine, he said, and I'm just going to throw this out there. He's like, look, this is for interviews, opportunities to meet guys. But he said, I've maybe met with 30, 35 players. 4 of them I've given check marks. Now, he didn't tell us the 4. Gosh dang it. 4 of them I've given checks, meaning those guys he felt had the it factor. They're guys that are fired up about football. They love to talk football. They got to stand up when they talk. They want to impress you. They want to show you how much they know. When you give them something to study and then come back and show them how much you're able to take in your football intelligence to recall the information, they want to show you that. They look at it as a competition. He said 4 guys had that it factor, at least as of now. That's what the Combine's for. It's for interviews to meet these guys. He said, look, the guys aren't out there running around in underwear in the NFL. Dan Campbell's not on the scouting side, but you're kind of cross-checking things when it comes to the Combine. But you're not scouting players here. You're scouting them through film. That's where you're scouting them through the film. He wants a guy with conviction, meaning that if I put you in a corner and I want a black or white answer, I want to get that black or white answer. If I ask you a question, I want you to be confident. I want you to have conviction in that answer. Nah, this is the answer, my boy. This is what it is. It's B. It's B. It's not B. But at least you had conviction. No, but seriously, he said he's looking for a conviction, a guy that can handle pressure, right? He doesn't, he wants guys that can handle pressure in those types of moments, in-game situations, and can laugh at themselves because it's kind of that lively locker room. It's the kind of the culture that they have, but, good personality, a personality that you want to be around. That makes sense. You're coaching these guys every day. I could understand why you want a guy that, you can joke around with. That makes sense. Going back to the offense side real quick, we touched on DeAndre Swift with Brad Holmes. He was asked about DeAndre Swift, and he said that, we tried to take care of him last year. He's a very talented running back, but this year we're kind of going to reset. We're going to try to find another way because we thought we had it in the offseason, and then we got to the regular season, and he was banged up. He came out really hot, and then he was banged up, and then we got him back, and he kind of got going again towards the end of the season. So he said, you know what, we'll restart, and we'll try a different way this year. We know he's working. We know he's very talented, and we're going to try a different approach this season because that's something that we have to do. Tied to that, which I do want to point out just really quickly, and we may do its own specific video, but if you didn't know, the Lions did hire Brett Fisher, who is highly recommended according to Brad Holmes, a guy that's working specifically on the medical side for the Detroit Lions. He's a guy that's very forward thinking, is the way that Brad Holmes put it. So that's something that has been added to the health side. They just want to get better in that department.
Feeling better?
No.
But again, speak on DeAndre Swift, I think he's going to be back next year. And these kind of quotes just make me feel that way just based on what he's saying. Kind of like he said last year, I think he said something similar. We want to get more athletic. We want to get smarter, which kind of comes with just development in general. And again, that's why you get some of those gurus at the position. And then also guys that maybe have that it factor that I just touched about, but still have that football intelligence, those instincts. Little things touched on here. He was asked about adding an edge rusher, and he's like, yeah, sure, you always want two really good edge rushers, and you would like to have guys that can push the pocket in the inside. Finally, about free agency, he's like, look, we don't need to go get the highest paid free agents or the guys that's ranked number one or go give out the massive, largest contract in free agency. We just need to get better. Right, we don't need the biggest name free agency. We don't need to go give out the $100 million deal. We just need to get better. We don't need that big name because if you think about it, in credit to the Lions, a lot of these guys that we brought in, talk about getting re-signed, but a lot of these guys that produced had their best seasons here. Charles Harris, Khalif Raymond. Khalif Raymond's been a stud. That guy just comes to mind immediately. But guys like that, DJ Chark this past season, he was a little bit of a bigger deal. But the guys that kind of go under the radar, Evan Brown was acquired. Like those types of players that kind of go under the radar, but in fairness, like they have and they've earned it, and it's like, okay, they're actually some studs now, and they get more value. They'd actually have more value going elsewhere. The pickup of Josh Reynolds was kind of a no-brainer, but just things like that to their credit, where they've been able to find some Isaiah Buggs, Benito Jones this past season. Like those guys, I mean, they probably have more value now than they did before the season because they were just available. It's like, hey, the season's about to start, but they're available. But they would have more value now hitting free agency if the Lions didn't bring them back to actually go get a deal somewhere because they're still young and they show what they could be. So to credit to them is like, hey, we don't need to go get the biggest name. We just need to get better. We just need to pinpoint where we need to get better, and we got to get better. We got to get guys that fit our culture. So with that, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Those are my takeaways from the Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell's presser. I know there's a pretty good amount of notes in that, but you know how we do. I had some good notes that I wanted to hit on there. Thank you, Pride, for watching, and I'm out.